Lawyers, what were your "this guy isn't winning" cases? Story 1. Not a lawyer, but I felt the need to share my own singular sovereign citizen experience. Canadian, by the way. I was in traffic court, waiting for my turn. A guy was called up. He stood up, and he looked respectable. Business suit, clean, hair combed, carrying a suitcase. I would have guessed he was a lawyer if he had been sitting ahead of the bar. He stood up and said out loud, "Well, I have a driver's license with that name on it. But since it's in capitals, you can see that's the name of a corporation, Your Honor." The justice on the bench did his best to be reasonable with him. But the guy immediately started a speech about how the system is corrupt and needs to change. He went on about that several times over the next while. The first time, the justice said, "That's not what we're here to discuss today. We're here for a speeding ticket. And if the defendant's name doesn't present himself in front of this bar, I'm ruling a conviction in absence." So the defendant hustled in front of the bar, officially presenting himself for the case. Behind the bar is gallery only, and proceeded to launch into an indignant series of acid-borne arguments that were so bizarre they verged on schizophrenia. Highlights included trying to invoke papal law, to which the justice responded, "Papal law? This isn't Rome. That doesn't apply here." Then the defendant tried to quote Admiralty law, which perplexed the justice. "Where do you get Admiralty law? This is Alberta, the most landlocked province in the country. Where do you get Admiralty law?" The defendant replied, straight-faced and serious, "Well, there used to be a fountain in the basement, sir." Mind you, the defendant hadn't even entered his initial plea yet. Multiple times, the justice tried to steer him back on track, and the guy kept responding, "Well, I did it, but that's not the point." So, well after a bailiff had been called to keep an eye on him, and I, witnessing this, had finally realized I wasn't dreaming, the justice on the bench finally said, "Okay, fine. You've said you've done it multiple times before, and I'll accept that as a guilty plea." He handed out the fine and gave him 30 days to pay. Next case. Story 2. My client was on trial for first-degree murder, and OJ's case looked like a plot from Suits compared to this. Nobody has ever been worse at crime in the history of crime. We were appointed counsel, which means we were private employees who sort of offer to be on standby when they run out of public defenders. We were his fifth lawyers. He'd fired the 4 prior because they kept telling him to just get started on the life sentence since it was already over. They were right. My client was on trial because he executed his girlfriend with 2 gunshots. He did it because she had secretly aborted a pregnancy that might have been his. He found out when he picked her up at the clinic. As they drove home, both of them live-texted their hour-long conversation, including all his threats to kill her for this when they got home, which he did. My client's apartment building had recently upgraded to full-color, telescopic 4K security cameras. We think he didn't know the upgrade had closed the blind spots. The footage looked like film from the Super Bowl. My client was also the only 6 feet 4 inches Hispanic man with bright red hair and a taste for rare designer sneakers that I, and his victim, had ever met. This made it difficult to argue it was not him, while the prosecution played his Gotham City highlight reel on a projector. Not only did my client shoot her with his own gun, he also brought his phone with him while he drove out to the remote spot where it was found. He then texted his friend to buy him the next one-way ticket to a different country, no questions asked. He made sure to give him his credit card to buy it though, because we can't leave our homies on the hook for that bill. Finally, my client had to hide his grin under his hand while the victim's family cried on the stand. The jury deliberated for 43 minutes. Story 3. This happened to a friend of mine a few years back in Canada versus TELUS. TELUS had offered a promotion on his contract, and he would always call in and ask to keep his original contract price, which was $15 cheaper than what it was worth now. So every year, he would call and ask if he could extend his contract by another year. Well, last year, since that price was practically non-existent, they immediately bumped up his price when he phoned in, stating that he was on a glitched account and that his original contract was moot because they hadn't signed a new contract every time they extended it. So they charged him over $8,000 for the plan. But what TELUS didn't do, or what this rep and the whole department didn't do, was asked to see the contract he had first, and if they had, they would have seen that he did in fact have valid extensions. He had emails, phone calls, dates, letters, and pictures to prove it. So he took TELUS to court, hired a fancy lawyer, and sued for I think the maximum in BC small claims is $40,000, so $40,000 for mental anguish, breach of contract, and pressure tactics. And he won. The lawyer had warned Telus and said, "Hey, I put a lot of evidence into discovery for you guys to comb over. Are you sure you want to pursue this? It's a pretty strong case. I highly advise you to look at this." Telus said there was no need. They had their proof. Their proof? The original contract with an end date. Their defense team looked super smug and happy. My buddy's proof? All the amended contract emails, agent names, dates, phone call transcripts he got from Telus, everything. The judge ruled in my buddy's favor and even made the comment, "He gave you a chance." Story 4. Okay, it wasn't my client, but I was prosecuting a case. DWI third offense, reckless driving, negligent use of a firearm. Not relevant here, but the law on that one needs to change. If you're drunk and a cop finds you with it in the car, that's enough to convict. 99% of the time, though, our office would dismiss that charge for a DWI plea and assault on a police officer. In our jurisdiction, DWI fourth offense is a felony, so a preliminary hearing is required. Those are usually waived since it's pretty clear if probable cause exists in DWIs, but the defendant was pro-SE and refused to waive. So I finished my questioning of the officer. The defendant requested cross-examination. His first question, "Isn't it true you only added the assault charge because when I hit you, you started crying like a bitch?" The entire courtroom was stunned. The judge told him to watch his language and recommended that he be represented by an attorney since the question was also an admission. Pretty sure he just wanted to do it for the spectacle. He said, "No further questions." The judge ruled that probable cause existed to continue, and he came over to me to talk about pleas. We wrapped that up before the end of the day. Story 5. Order of protection case. The victim filed. The abuser showed up to court in a suit with sunglasses on. I don't have proof of this, but he was a meth addict, so I'm pretty sure he was trying to hide his pinpoint pupils. The abuser decided he was going to exercise his right to hear what he had done and question the victim. The victim got up on the stand and answered his questions honestly. One of his questions was, "Why are you working with the police to put me under surveillance via cameras and my light fixtures?" The victim responded, "There are no cameras. You're on meth and hallucinating." Cue the courtroom erupting in laughter, including the court employees. I've never seen a courtroom get so loud in real life. The judge started yelling for quiet and banging the gavel. The victim was terrified she had done something wrong and kept apologizing to the judge. At the end, the judge granted the longest order of protection possible under state law, then excused the victim and her family. As the victim was walking out, the judge laid into the abuser about how much of a disgrace he was to the community and how his parents and grandparents were rolling over in their graves. He told him he should be ashamed of himself. The judge continued until he was sure the victim had time to get in her vehicle and leave. Story 6. I'm not a lawyer, but my mother-in-law's divorce attorney would have a great answer to this. My father-in-law started to suffer from early-onset dementia, which triggered a series of events that resulted in my mother-in-law, not wrongly, filing for divorce. Throughout the 3 years of divorce proceedings, my father-in-law's condition became very obvious, to the point where he was showing up to court in garbage bags when his lawyer was able to get him there. By the end of the divorce, he was living in a memory care facility, which was about as close to hell on earth as you'd imagine, and his sister had power of attorney. When everything was settled, their estate was split 50-50. Yet my mother-in-law insisted he was faking it and that he had hidden millions in offshore accounts. So she sued. She couldn't prove he ever had millions of dollars in the first place. She insisted he was faking it despite several doctors attesting to his condition. So pretty much all of the proceedings were she's not winning. But she insisted. When their divorce proceedings were finalized, she had over $750,000. By the time her failed attempt to sue ended, she was down to $125,000. Story 7. I'm not a lawyer, but I had a law class that was taught by a lawyer who told us this story and had us do a project on this active case he was a part of. It wasn't civil, and he wasn't committing any crimes by having us do this. Basically, this guy decided he wanted to see his kid on his kid's birthday and went over to his wife's house. They were living separately. The kid said he wanted to go with his dad, but his mom wouldn't let him, so this dude forcibly grabbed the kid and tried to leave. His wife then attacked him, and he ended up grabbing a hammer and hitting her with it a couple of times. When it was time for court, this guy decided he didn't want a lawyer and would rather defend himself since he had done that before and won somehow. Well, in his pre-trial hearing, not even in trial yet, he tried to get out of it by claiming that his name wasn't actually what was on the judge's sheet because he writes his name in all capital letters, which makes it an LLC. Obviously, the judge didn't care because that's not how it works. But the dude kept claiming he didn't recognize the charges against him and insisted his LLC was being sued, not him as an individual. The judge decided to revoke his right to represent himself due to this. She claimed he wasn't competent to represent himself because he refused to acknowledge he wasn't being charged as an LLC and assigned him a lawyer. He ended up losing the case and got really pissed off because he thought he could have won if he had defended himself. So he appealed and claimed the judge took away his civil rights. However, in his appeal, he conveniently chose not to send the transcript of the competency hearing that the judge used to determine whether he could represent himself. Again, in this appeal, he was given a lawyer and not allowed to represent himself, who was my teacher this time. He then tried to sue my teacher because he didn't want a lawyer that badly. My teacher got unassigned from the case after telling the judge, but the guy didn't win the appeal, LOL. Story 8. I'm not an attorney, but I work for the state equivalent of the IRS. My job is to resolve tax disputes before trial, and if they go to trial, I am the state's primary witness. This means I'm subject to cross-examination by the other side, typically the taxpayer. I was dealing with a difficult, agitated taxpayer for an extended period of time. This is common before trial. We try not to go to trial, so there was a prolonged period of me trying to explain why we did what we did. I had some brutal trial prep with our attorneys to get me ready for anticipated cross-examination. To reiterate, I work for the state equivalent of the IRS, with the IRS being a federal agency. I gave my testimony. Then the taxpayer was allowed to cross-examine me. He asked me, why did the IRS disallow my refund? I explained for about the 5th time that I do not work for the IRS, and I do not know why the IRS did what they did. He would need to ask the IRS. I was tempted to comment that if the IRS also disallowed his refund, it would appear the stateside adjustment was also correct, since we follow federal law. I decided against it. Next, he said, no further questions. Going to trial is expensive. Both sides had to split the cost of the court stenographer, $1,400, so $700 each. During the lead up to the trial, I told him multiple times that we are not the IRS. This dude literally paid $700 to ask me under oath if I worked for the IRS, because apparently me telling him multiple times that I do not, and all of our correspondence being on my state's letterhead, was not good enough for him. I think he may have had some brutal follow-up questions for the IRS and was completely blindsided by this revelation. I don't know. The amount at issue was about $3,000, so $700 was a hefty amount for the taxpayer. Of course, he lost. We knew we were probably going to win before trial, but when he declined to even ask me any questions that could advance his case, it was clearly over. Story 9. My squad was searching a stash house on a warrant. This was part of a takedown of a violent organization, and there were a bunch of houses being searched at the same time. The house I was in was a known stash for guns and drugs, and during our investigation, one of our UCs had bought multiple guns that came out of this house. I was searching the kitchen in full kit when someone opened the back door and popped their head in. I turned around. He looked at me. I looked at him. Then he backed out and slammed the door shut. I ran to the door, opened it, and he was standing right there with his hands up. I sat him down on the patio steps and started to get his information while my sergeant ran him through NCIC. The guy was cooperative but wide-eyed and nervous as fuck. As I stood there and began to look at his waistline, I could see a clear outline of a gun in his jacket pocket. My BWC footage showed what was almost textbook printing of the gun while I stood in front of him. He didn't fight. He just accepted getting cuffed and arrested for possession of a handgun by a prohibited person. He went to booking, and after getting into the jail, he made a phone call. Keep in mind that the phone system very clearly says all conversations are monitored and recorded. During this phone call, he told the other party that he had a satchel with $700 cash and coke that he tossed over the fence before I came out the back door. A couple of detectives went over there and found the bag. There had been a big snowfall that morning, and there were no footsteps anywhere near the bag. The bag didn't have any snow on top of it. Inside the bag was $700 cash, cocaine, and the guy's driver's license. Dude filed a motion to suppress. His position was that I had no right to detain him. He lost that motion pretty badly and pled out. Our state's attorney cited something like 7 clearly established cases showing that his position was comically wrong at best. At the end of the hearing, the judge told the guy he was going to put him in an employment education program because he needed to find a new job since he was so terrible at being a drug dealer. Story 10. Not a lawyer, but my ex-wife dragged out custody hearings for several years, all in a bid to keep me paying for her standard of living. Her main tactic was character assassination, and after several years of that, it wasn't working terribly well because, well, all of the officials involved could plainly see that I was nothing like the person she described. So, once it became clear they didn't believe her stories that I was abusive, violent, negligent, or a likely pedophile, based on readily observed evidence from several years of hearings, she tried to argue that I was financially unreliable. Again, she was trying to get money out of me and sole custody of our daughter. Hold on to your butts, it gets dumber. I was enlisted in the Air Force at the time. She told the judge she expected me to get discharged in the near future because of a list of debunked accusations. The judge asked me if that was true, and I answered honestly that the only time it was ever even suggested I might face discharge was when we were still married, because she called my first sergeant and commander daily trying to get me discharged. Once we were divorced and they no longer had to answer her calls, it never came up again. In fact, I was the highest ranking, second most awarded, and most knowledgeable person in the unit. The judge asked her if what I said was true. She said it was, that she had actively tried to get me discharged. In my head, I'm screaming that she tried to get me discharged so she could justify cutting me out of our daughter's life entirely. But I glanced at my lawyer and saw that he suddenly looked very interested in what was happening, so I sat quietly. The judge asked her again, in very careful tones, "You admit that you actively tried to get the sole source of income for you and your daughter essentially fired from the job that provides said income?" She said yes. The judge asked why. She said, "Because I don't think he's a good fit for that job." My lawyer put down his notes and smiled. Story 11. It was a civil case when I worked for a housing association. Basically, we owned a cul-de-sac, and almost every resident was complaining about one resident in particular. Unfortunately, the other residents weren't of the highest character or were friends with this problem resident. We also suspected this person was a drug dealer of some sort, but that case was still being built, so we couldn't use it in court. Our star witness was a former doctor who had just moved in, as it was one of the few available bungalows we had. Even they, with no prior knowledge, had made a complaint about this resident. Sadly, they were undergoing chemotherapy treatment when the case was brought to court, so we had very little to go on. We had a lawyer who looked green as grass. He basically just said to us, "We'll say we're still expecting the star witness to arrive. They have an appointment they couldn't move, and we'll just act confidently and keep a poker face." We went into court, and their lawyer also looked green as grass. Our lawyer explained our side and mentioned that our witness wasn't present yet. Their lawyer stood up and started talking about all these different laws and protections his client had, and about our obligations as a housing association. The judge just shut him down. "Don't lecture me on what the law is. I've been doing this far longer than you have." Their lawyer sheepishly sat down. We talked a little about the case for a couple of minutes. Their lawyer stood up again and said that if our witness didn't appear within a certain amount of time, we must continue on without them. The judge cut in again, more harshly this time. "Yes, I am aware of how things work in a court. Be seated now and wait, or make your plea now." They lost their bottle and asked for the case to be ended. The problem tenant agreed to accept responsibility, and an agreement was worked out between them and the housing association. It wasn't the client who lost them the case. It was the lawyer who couldn't shut up and ended up losing the client's confidence. Story 12. I do IT work for law enforcement in a small city. One day, police were called to an old folks' home because an old man, who didn't live there, was harassing them during bingo. Police arrived, asked him to leave, and he became belligerent and attacked an officer. He was quickly subdued, a textbook takedown, and he sustained no injuries. Neither the residents nor the police wanted to press charges, and he was soon released. Here's where things get funny. We have a local politician who is a real clout chaser, and they must have been salivating at the thought of having a pet injustice for their narrative, but they backed the wrong horse with this guy. Footage from the old folks' home was requested. I obscure civilians' faces, hence my involvement, and the local news did a little piece with the politician. They showed footage from the old folks' home edited to flash cut from when the officers first confronted the man to the takedown, making it look like the officers slammed him unprovoked. The news piece ended with a short interview with the man, during which he said that the officer got lucky and that if he hadn't been surprised, he would have kicked the officer's ass. Telling, since that was probably the best quote they could get. Emboldened, no doubt, by this charade with the media, and likely imagining the blurred, edited video was the only evidence, he decided he wanted to press charges. Only, in the unedited video, you can clearly see him attack the officer, and you can see the look of absolute terror on the unblurred faces of all the witnesses, who were not consulted for the news story, but were very happy to testify. There was also bodycam footage showing the officer weathered several attacks while trying to de-escalate, and only performed a takedown when the man grabbed and attempted to unholster the officer's firearm. My involvement with the case ended there, but I can't imagine it went well for him. Story 13. My firm represented a mom bringing a case on behalf of her 2-year-old son. Mom and dad were separated, and the son was with dad's parents. While the son was in their care, Grandma started mowing the lawn and accidentally ran over her grandson. He suffered serious lacerations on both legs, and one of his feet had to be amputated. Grandma and Grandpa didn't have a lot of money, so their home was on the line. We offered a settlement where their home would be put in a trust. They would be able to live in it for the rest of their lives, and after they passed, it would be sold and the proceeds put toward their grandson's medical expenses. They refused because they had other grandkids they wanted to inherit the house, ignoring the fact that they didn't run over their other grandkids with a lawnmower. They took the case all the way to trial, with their defense being that mom was late picking up the kid, and that awarding him a large judgment would damage their relationship with their grandson. They lost, and the jury awarded the grandson $2 million. Story 14. Not a lawyer, but I was tangentially involved in a case where someone tried to commit disability fraud over a traffic accident they'd suffered on the job. They claimed a specific type of back injury, the details of which elude me. He said he was in so much pain he could barely walk, which was at odds with pictures of him taking a ski trip after the accident, as well as videos of him dancing at a friend's wedding, both posted on social media, which his lawyer tried to explain away as him having good days and bad days with his injury. Anyway, this guy is in court, sitting at the table, making a big show of hunching over with a pained expression, occasionally reaching a hand back to rest on his lower back. Up walks the star witness for our company, an occupational therapist specializing in back injuries. He gets sworn in, and the lawyer spends maybe 30 minutes establishing his credentials. Then he gets to the fun part. Lawyer, are you familiar with type of back injury the worker claimed he had? Doctor, yes, extensively. Lawyer, does it have any notable characteristics? Doctor, several. One of the most obvious is that a person with this injury will experience significant pain anytime their back is curled or bent. For instance, hunching over like this, the doctor hunches over exactly as the worker is posed at the defense table, would put them in excruciating agony. Most people suffering from this injury prefer to stand rather than sit, and when they do sit, they will try to stretch out their legs and lean back in their chair to keep their body as straight as possible. This was pretty much the exact opposite of how the worker was sitting the entire trial. Needless to say, the worker did not win his case. As a side note, I will never forget the way his eyes popped up and his face adopted an "oh, shit" expression when the doctor began describing the posture associated with this injury. Story 15. I was sort of on the sidelines for this case, but it stuck with me. I was a dumb junior associate given a babysitting job representing a big box store. The store had filed charges against a former employee for theft. It was a gift card scam. The employee would go into the aisles, grab items, process them as returns, and put the balance on a gift card. Police arrested the employee, and the state was prosecuting. The defense wanted to watch the tapes of the alleged fraud, and the prosecutor asked my client's loss prevention manager to explain everything since it involved multiple cameras and different timestamps. I just had to show up to mind the client. I ended up talking with the defense attorney while we were waiting, and he told me this story about how, yeah, his client had a record and a tough history, but he really believed she was turning things around and was innocent of this. He just really believed she was innocent. I had no basis to judge. I hadn't even seen the tapes myself. So I just nodded and listened. He really believed in his client. As we were in the courtroom waiting for the assistant DA to finish her motions, my client nudged me. We were no longer with the defense attorney and pointed at a guy in the courtroom. That's him. That's him. Next to the defendant. Having never seen the tapes and just being a junior associate there to mind my client, I had no background on this, nor did I care about the outcome. So I said, "He is who? What are you talking about?" "That's the guy from the tape. It's her boyfriend." It still wasn't quite clicking for me, so again, I just nodded. Then, the DA finished up, and we all went into a conference room. We started playing the tapes. My client explained what the defendant was doing, taking products, processing fake returns, and putting the credit on a gift card. My client matched the timestamps against a report, and the card the values were added to. Then we fast-forwarded a few days, different store, and watched a guy walk up to the register and buy a bunch of things using the same gift card the defendant had credited 2 days earlier. The defense attorney asked, "Have you ever seen that man before?" My client replied, "Yes, sir. He was sitting next to your client earlier today in court." I legit felt bad for the defense counsel. He bowed his head, put his hands in his hair, sighed, and asked the DA for the room so he could conference with his client. Never heard from any of them again. Story 16. Anyone who believes the world is out to get them. Vague, right? It comes in all shapes and sizes, ranging from true schizophrenic delusions to simply blame everyone else for my problems and take zero responsibility. Those people are the absolute worst clients and will actively get in their own way. They won't listen to your advice. They take up a disproportionate amount of your time. And to top it all off, they'll probably leave you a bad review because you had the audacity to tell them, "No, that's not how the law works." Some of those people end up winning in the sense that they get what they wanted, but it's almost always less than what they could have gotten if they had just listened to the attorney they're paying. I used to do a lot of consultations, and if someone started going on a 20-plus minute tangent about all the ways the world and everyone else was out to get them, it was a no for me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, activate the notification bell, and share a similar story or anything you'd like to say in the comments. See you next time.